Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Aileen Wuornos. Before we begin, I want you to find your most comfortable position. Adjust your pillows. Let the heavy warmth of your blanket settle over you like a gentle fog. Imagine the air around you cooling, turning into the crisp, biting wind of a Michigan autumn. We are traveling back in time to the mid-20th century, to a small suburb of Detroit called Rochester. The streets are quiet, lined with modest homes and the skeletal-reaching branches of oak trees. It is a place that looks peaceful from a distance, but as we move closer, the details begin to blur and darken. The world we are entering is one of cold winters, gray skies, and the profound silence of a house where secrets are buried deep beneath the floorboards. Breathe deeply now, and let the modern world fade away. Our story begins on a very specific day, an anomaly in the calendar. It was February 29th, 1956, a leap year birth. On this day, Aileen Carol Pittman entered a world that seemed to have no room for her. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was only 16 years old, a child herself caught in a marriage that was already dissolving. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a man whose mind was a labyrinth of shadows. He was a diagnosed schizophrenic with a history of violence and predatory behavior. By the time Aileen drew her first breath, her parents had already filed for divorce. She would never meet her father. He was a ghost in her life, existing only as a name on a birth certificate and later as a prisoner serving time for heinous crimes against children. He eventually took his own life in a prison cell in 1969, but for young Aileen, the damage of his absence and his bloodline had already begun to take root. Imagine the feeling of a cold house in January 1960. Aileen was not yet 4 years old. Her older brother, Keith, was only 5. On a day that would define the rest of their lives, their mother, Diane, walked away. She simply left them. There was no long goodbye, no explanation that a small child could understand. She handed her children over to her own parents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, and vanished into the gray Michigan horizon. For Aileen, this was the first great abandonment, the first shattering of trust. She and Keith were legally adopted by their grandparents a few months later. They were told that Lori and Britta were their biological parents, a lie that would persist for years, weaving a web of confusion and betrayal into the very foundation of her identity. The home on Hickory Drive in Troy, Michigan, became her entire world, but it was a world devoid of safety. The atmosphere in the Wuornos household was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the sharp, medicinal tang of cheap alcohol. Both grandparents were heavy drinkers, their moods shifting like the unpredictable Great Lakes weather. Lori Wuornos, the man Aileen believed was her father, was a figure of terror. He was volatile and cruel, subjecting the children to frequent beatings. Aileen would later recount memories of being forced to strip and endure physical and sexual abuse at his hands. There was no sanctuary. Her grandmother, Britta, was often lost in an alcoholic haze, unable or unwilling to protect the children from the darkness within their own walls. Even the bond between Aileen and her brother Keith became distorted by their shared trauma. They were two lost souls in a house of horrors, clinging to each other in ways that were both desperate and damaging. When Aileen was only 6 years old, a fire broke out, a reckless act of rebellion by the two children, leaving Aileen with visible scars on her face, physical marks of the internal fire that was already consuming her spirit. As the years stretched into the 1960s, Aileen became a ghost in the hallways of her school. She was a shy, nervous child, often unkempt and smelling of the cigarettes she had learned to trade for the smallest glimpses of kindness or basic necessities. By the age of 11, the boundaries of her childhood had completely eroded. She began engaging in sexual activity at school and in the neighborhood, trading herself for food, beer, or cigarettes. It was a survival mechanism born of a world that taught her that her body was her only currency. She was navigating a landscape of predators, unaware that the path she was walking was leading her further and further away from the light. She was a child of the Michigan woods, finding more comfort in the cold earth and the shadows of the pines than she ever did in the company of the adults who were supposed to care for her. The breaking point arrived in 1970. At just 14 years old, Aileen became pregnant. She claimed the father was a friend of her grandfather, an older man who had exploited her vulnerability. In the harsh, judgmental climate of the early 70s, there was no sympathy for a girl like Aileen. She was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, where she gave birth to a son on March 23, 1971. Within days, her grandfather forced her to give the child up for adoption. He was a part of her she would never know, another leaf torn from her branch. When she returned home, the last of her fragile support system collapsed. Her grandmother died of liver failure shortly after, and Laurie, now alone and even more embittered, threw 15-year-old Aileen out of the house. With no home, no family, and no future, she retreated into the woods near her old house, sleeping in abandoned cars and under the stars, beginning a life of hitchhiking that would eventually lead her far from the Michigan snows to the sun-drenched, blood-stained highways of Florida. We leave her there for now, a girl in the shadows, waiting for the road to take her away. By the late 80s, the Florida sun had a way of bleaching the color out of everything: the billboards, the asphalt, and perhaps even the spirit of a woman who had spent years adrift. Aileen was 33 years old now, her face etched with the hard miles of a life lived on the margins. She frequented the interstate interchanges, the places where people were always moving, always passing through. The air in November of 1989 was unusually thick, a humid blanket that clung to the pine trees and the swampy undergrowth. She stood by the roadside, a figure caught in the flickering neon of a nearby truck stop, watching the headlights of passing cars like bioluminescent creatures in the dark. It was a cycle of survival, a rhythm of brief encounters, and the constant hum of tires on the pavement. On the 30th of November, 1989, a white Cadillac pulled over. Behind the wheel was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater. He was a man of some means, dressed in a way that suggested comfort, a stark contrast to the worn denim and tired eyes of the woman he invited into his vehicle. The interior of the Cadillac smelled of expensive upholstery and stale tobacco, a sanctuary of air-conditioned stillness against the oppressive Florida heat. Aileen climbed in, the heavy door closing with a solid, final thud. They spoke in low tones, a negotiation of time and money that was as routine as breathing for her. But beneath the surface of this mundane transaction, a dark current was beginning to pull, dragging them both toward a destination that neither could have truly anticipated. They drove away from the lights of the highway, turning onto the winding, unpaved roads that snaked through the thickets of Volusia County. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the moss-draped branches of live oaks that looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the car. Aileen felt the familiar prickle of unease, a sensation she had learned to live with but never truly ignore. The further they went into the woods, the more the world of civilization faded. Here, the law of the road was replaced by the law of the shadow. The car eventually slowed to a crawl, the tires crunching over dry leaves and fallen twigs before coming to a rest in a clearing where the moonlight struggled to penetrate the dense, tangled canopy of the trees. What happened in the silence of that clearing remains a point of intense debate. Aileen would later claim that Richard Mallory became a monster the moment the engine stopped, and that she fought a desperate surge of self-preservation. In the confined space of the Cadillac, the air grew thin. She reached for the .22 caliber pistol she kept hidden. The sound of the first shot was deafening, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness of the woods. It was followed by others, 3 or 4 rounds fired in a frantic, terrifying sequence. When the echoes finally died away, the silence that returned was heavier than before, a silence that marked the end of one life and the transformation of another. The darkness inside the car was absolute, broken only by the fading heat of the weapon. In the aftermath, the adrenaline must have been a cold fire in her veins. She moved with a calculated, numb efficiency. She took Mallory's wallet, his watch, and his car, leaving his body in the brush near the roadside, partially concealed by the dense vegetation and the gathering gloom. She drove the white Cadillac back toward the main roads, a ghost behind the wheel of a dead man's prize. She stopped at a bridge over a small creek, tossing the keys and other incriminating items into the murky water, watching the ripples disappear into the blackness. She was now a woman with a secret that could never be untold, a woman who had crossed a line from which there was no returning. The weight of the pistol in her bag felt different now, no longer just a tool for defense. The sun rose over Volusia County on the 13th of December, 1989, with a deceptive brightness. A deputy noticed something out of place near the entrance to a wooded trail. It was the body of Richard Mallory. The discovery sent a shockwave through the local department. Investigators found several shell casings and noted the precision of the shots. They searched for his missing car, eventually finding it abandoned in an area known for transient activity. The name Richard Mallory became a file on a desk, a puzzle of a man with a hidden history and a tragic end. The investigation was just beginning, but for now, the clues were sparse and the trail was cold. The highway continued to hum with the sound of thousands of cars, each one a potential encounter, each one a mystery waiting to unfold. After the discovery of Richard Mallory in the final weeks of 1989, a strange and heavy silence fell over the Florida highways. For nearly 6 months, the salt air and the rhythmic hum of tires on the interstate were the only constants. The investigation into Mallory's death had stalled, his belongings scattered through pawn shops that had yet to be linked to a single face. But as the spring of 1990 bled into a sweltering June, the quiet was shattered. The humidity began to cling to the skin like a damp veil, and the woods along the peripheries of the pavement started to give up their secrets. The trail of names was about to grow, etched into the landscape of the Sunshine State with a chilling regularity that defied the peaceful, vacation-like atmosphere of the region. On the 1st of June, 1990, the progression resumed in Citrus County. A construction worker named David Spears, aged 43, was found abandoned along the shoulder of Highway 19. The scene was hauntingly specific. He was completely nude, stripped of the life he had been living in Winter Garden, except for a single baseball cap that lay near his head. He had been shot 6 times in the torso. There was no struggle visible in the dirt, only the stark reality of a man discarded in the brush. The investigators noted the caliber of the weapon, a small .22 that spoke of a killer who didn't need a heavy hand to exert total control. The heat that afternoon was oppressive, making the task of the forensic teams even more grueling as they sifted through the pine needles and sand for a clue that wasn't there. Only 5 days later, on June 6, 1990, the interstate claimed another soul. In Pasco County, the body of 40-year-old Charles Carskadden was discovered. He was a part-time rodeo worker, a man who moved between towns and lived a life of transient labor. His body, like Spears, was left in a state of undress under the canopy of the Florida trees. The medical examiner would find 9 small-caliber bullets lodged within his chest and upper abdomen. The sheer number of shots suggested a frantic intensity, or perhaps a deep-seated rage that was beginning to boil over. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 2 men, both found off major transit routes, both shot multiple times with the same type of ammunition, and both left exposed to the elements. The highway was no longer a path to a destination. It was becoming a hunting ground. By July, the mystery shifted from the bodies found to the people who were vanishing. Peter Seams was a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman and a dedicated missionary. He had left Jupiter, Florida, in June, intending to drive north to New Jersey, but his journey ended abruptly in the humid heart of the state. On the 4th of July, 1990, while the rest of the country celebrated with fireworks, a different kind of flash occurred in Orange Springs. His car was found crashed and abandoned. Witnesses described two women, one with sun-bleached hair and another with a darker, more shadows-hidden appearance, fleeing the scene of the wreck. Though Peter's body was never found, he became a ghost in the machine of the investigation. Inside the vehicle, a silent witness remained. A palm print on the interior door handle, a smudge of identity left behind in the rush to escape the light of day. The dog days of August brought a new level of terror. On the 4th of August, 1990, the search for Troy Burress ended in the deep, shaded reaches of the Ocala National Forest. He was a 50-year-old family man, a traveling sausage salesman who had simply failed to return from his delivery route. His truck had been found abandoned days earlier, a metal shell in the middle of nowhere. When his body was finally located, the cause of death was familiar: 2 gunshot wounds to the torso. The forest, usually filled with the sounds of birds and the rustle of palmettos, felt suffocatingly still. The predator was moving north, weaving through the counties with a geographic fluidity that kept the local sheriff departments from connecting the dots quickly enough to save the next man in line. September added the most high-profile name to the ledger. On the 12th of September, 1990, the body of Charles Humphreys, known to his peers as Dick, was discovered in Marion County. He was 56 years old, a retired Air Force major and a former police chief. He was a man of the law, someone who understood the risks of the road better than most. Yet he was found shot 7 times, his body fully clothed but discarded with the same lack of ceremony as the others. His car was later recovered in Suwannee County, miles away from where he had taken his final breath. The realization that a former police officer had fallen victim to this phantom of the highways sent a tremor of urgency through the various task forces. They were no longer just looking for a killer. They were looking for someone who could best a man trained in defense. The trail of 7 names reached its grim conclusion on the 19th of November, 1990. In a remote pocket of Dixie County, near a lonely logging road, where the only light came from the filtered sun through the oaks, the body of Walter Gino Antonio was found. He was 62 years old, a truck driver and a reserve police officer. He had been shot 4 times in the back and head. His partially disrobed body lay in the soft earth, a final testament to a year of unprecedented violence along the Florida corridors. From Mallory in December to Antonio in November, the map was now dotted with 7 points of tragedy. The investigation was finally coalescing around a description of 2 women, a silver car, and a series of pawned items that would soon provide the names they were truly looking for. The shadows were beginning to recede, but the weight of those 7 lives remained heavy on the Florida soil. The highway in Florida is not merely a strip of pavement. It is a living, breathing creature that hums with a relentless, low-frequency energy. In the late 1980s and the dawn of the 1990s, the asphalt of Interstate 75 and Interstate 4 shimmered under a sun that felt heavy, almost liquid, in its intensity. This was the landscape where Aileen lived, a world defined by the white lines on the shoulder and the rhythmic thrum of tires against concrete. To most travelers, these roads were a means to an end, a transit between the neon lights of Orlando and the salty breeze of the Gulf Coast. But for those who inhabited the fringes, the interstate was a workplace, a sanctuary, and a predator all at once. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of diesel exhaust and the sweet, cloying smell of decaying palmettos. The humidity clings to the skin like a damp veil, never truly lifting, even when the sun dips below the horizon and the cicadas begin their electric scream. This was the environment of the transient, where names were optional and histories were written in the dust of rest area parking lots. Aileen's days were governed by the logic of the road. To be a hitchhiking sex worker in this era was to exist in a state of perpetual motion and constant, vibrating intuition. She stood on the soft shoulders of US 19, or tucked herself into the shadows of truck stops like the one near Wildwood, watching the slow parade of chrome and steel. Each approaching vehicle represented a choice, a gamble, and a potential paycheck. There is a specific sound to a car slowing down on a high-speed road, the gravel crunching under tires, the downshift of the engine, the hiss of brakes. For Aileen, that sound was the signal to put on a mask of approachable vulnerability. She would walk toward the passenger side, her boots clicking on the pavement, squinting through the glare of the windshield to catch a glimpse of the man behind the wheel. Most were just men looking for a brief escape from their own lives. Construction workers, salesmen, retirees. They were the invisible middle class of the Florida interior, driving white pickup vans or silver sedans that smelled of stale coffee and old upholstery. The financial weight of her life was a crushing, daily reality. Aileen was not just surviving for herself. She was the sole provider for Tyria Moore. They had met at the Zodiac Bar in Daytona Beach back in 1986, a meeting that had anchored Aileen's drifting soul, but also shackled her to a cycle of desperate earning. Tyria had been a motel maid, but soon the burden of their survival fell entirely on Aileen's shoulders. They moved from one flickering motel room to another, staying in places where the carpets were worn thin and the walls carried the ghosts of 1,000 temporary residents. The cost of a room, a pack of cigarettes, and enough food to get through the next 24 hours was a tally that never ended. Aileen spoke often of her love for Tyria, a fierce and protective devotion that fueled her long hours on the interstate. She wanted to provide a life of comfort, a dream of a stable home that seemed to retreat further away with every mile she traveled. This pressure created a volatile internal climate. Every date that turned sour, every man who haggled too hard over a $20 bill, added a layer of resentment to a heart that had already been hardened by decades of abuse. The dangerous landscape of the Florida highway system offered plenty of places to disappear. If you turn off the main arteries and head into the secondary roads, like State Road 415, the civilization of the strip malls and gas stations quickly gives way to the dense, unforgiving scrub. The Ocala National Forest stands as a vast, green silence in the center of the state, a place where the light struggles to reach the sandy floor through the canopy of live oaks and slash pines. This was where the whisper of the interstate became a chilling silence. Aileen knew these places well. She knew where the dirt tracks led deep into the woods, far enough that the roar of the traffic was reduced to a faint, ghostly memory. When she was in those woods, she was no longer the woman at the mercy of a stranger's whims. The power dynamic shifted in the shadows of the palmetto bushes. The very isolation that made her vulnerable on the side of the road became her greatest weapon. In the quiet of the forest, the transition from a desperate worker to a cold-blooded survivor was as swift as the click of a safety catch on a .22 caliber pistol. By the summer of 1990, the pattern was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It was a campaign of violence. The men who picked her up were often found weeks later, their bodies reclaimed by the heat and the insects of the Florida wilderness. David Spears, the construction worker, was found in Citrus County. Charles Karskadden, the rodeo worker, was discovered in Pasco County, wrapped in an electric blanket as if in some macabre attempt at comfort. Each crime scene was a mirror of the one before. A vehicle abandoned miles away, a body left in the brush, and the missing personal effects that Aileen would later pawn to pay for another week at a motel. She moved through these crimes with a terrifying practicality, driven by the need to return to Tyria with cash in hand. The world of the interstate provided the perfect cover. Thousands of people moved through these corridors every day, most of them looking straight ahead, never noticing the woman with the tangled blonde hair standing by the exit ramp. She was a ghost in the machinery of the Sunshine State, a whisper lost in the wind of a passing semi-truck. But ghosts leave traces, and the whispers were starting to grow into a roar. The very anonymity she relied on was beginning to fracture as she and Tyria became more reckless. They were seen together in the vehicles of the missing men, their presence noted by eagle-eyed clerks at convenience stores and witnesses at minor traffic accidents. The pressure was mounting, not just from the law, but from within. The relationship that had been her anchor was beginning to fray under the weight of the secrets they shared. As the heat of the Florida summer intensified, so did the desperation of their situation. The road was running out, and the next turn would lead them toward the bright, cold lights of an interrogation room. But for now, the tires continued to hum, and the sun continued to bake the asphalt of the interstate, oblivious to the blood that had been spilled in the shadows of its exits. The air in Florida during those years was a heavy, inescapable blanket. It smelled of sulfur from the tap water and the sweet, rot-tinged scent of the nearby palmetto scrub. Aileen and Tyria, or Ty as she was known, lived in the spaces most people only pass through. These were the motels with flickering neon signs that hummed like a chorus of angry insects. In places like the Last Resort or the small, wood-paneled rooms in Harbor Oaks, the world felt very small and very precarious. Imagine the sound of a window unit air conditioner, its rhythmic rattling failing to truly cool the damp air. Inside, the carpet was often thin and stained, carrying the faint scent of stale beer and old cigarettes. For Aileen, these rooms were the only home she had known in years. It had all started back in 1986, under the dim, smoky lights of a bar called Zodiac in South Daytona. Tyria was 24, a former motel maid from Ohio who had come south looking for something different. Aileen was 30, already hardened by a life that had been anything but kind. When they met, something clicked, a mutual need for a witness to their existence. Aileen called Ty her wife. For the first time, she wasn't just drifting. She was providing. She wanted to give Ty the world, or at least a world that didn't include the grinding poverty they both knew so well. But as Tyria quit her job, the burden of their survival fell entirely on Aileen's shoulders. The hustle became more than just survival. It became a desperate race against the clock. By the time 1989 arrived, the desperation had reached a fever pitch. Prostitution along the interstate was a dangerous, grueling way to make a living, and the returns were often meager. A few $20 bills here, a handful of change there. It wasn't enough to satisfy the hunger or the desire for the things Ty wanted: the car rentals, the better rooms, the sense of a life that wasn't lived on the jagged edge of the law. Aileen was exhausted. Her body was tired, and her mind was beginning to fracture under the weight of her own history. The first time she came back to the motel with more than just cash, the air in the room changed. She brought back items: a camera, a piece of jewelry, or a car that didn't belong to them. The transition from sex work to robbery was born of this financial void. They began a routine that would eventually become their undoing. They would drive to local pawn shops in Volusia County, carrying the remnants of men who would never go home. Aileen's thumbprint would press firmly onto the yellowed receipts as she traded a dead man's camera for a few days of breathing room. They sold a gold watch, a ring, and even the very tools the men used for their trades. To Ty, these items were a reprieve from the heat and the hunger. To the world outside, they were a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to their door. In the quiet of the motel room, they would sort through the wallets of the missing, keeping only the cold, hard cash. As the number of victims grew throughout 1990, the silence between them became a heavy, physical presence. Tyria was no longer just a passive partner. She was becoming a witness to a transformation. She saw the new guns, the erratic behavior, and the way Aileen would return from the highways looking like she had been through a war. The news began to carry sketches, composite drawings of two women, one with light, frizzy hair and a hard expression. The world was shrinking around them. In July of 1990, the tension finally snapped on a dusty road near Orange Springs. They were driving a Pontiac Sunbird that belonged to a man named Peter Seams. When the car crashed, they didn't wait for the police. They fled into the thick, humid woods. The crash was the beginning of the end for the silent partner. Fear replaced the loyalty that had once bound them together in the dark. Tyria could see the walls closing in, and the shadow of the law was longer than the shadows of the pines they hid among. She left Florida, heading back to the safety of Pennsylvania, leaving Aileen alone in the heat. Aileen was left to drown her sorrows in the dark corners of the last resort bar, drinking to forget the woman she had killed for and the woman who was now miles away. She sat on an old car seat outside the bar, a woman who had given everything to a relationship that was now a ghost. Every receipt and every memory Tyria held would soon be used to build the cage. The partner was no longer silent. The whispers were about to become a testimony. The air in the investigators' offices in late 1990 was heavy, not just with the usual Florida humidity, but with the mounting weight of 7 unsolved murders. For months, the detectives had been staring at a map of Central Florida, tracing the points where bodies had been discovered along the lonely stretches of the interstate. They were searching for a ghost, a phantom who moved through the shadows of truck stops and wooded turnoffs. But in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the crime lab, the ghosts were finally beginning to take shape. It started with the smell of old paper and the sharp, chemical scent of fingerprint dust. Tiny slips of paper, thin and yellowed, were brought in from pawn shops across the Daytona Beach area. These were the first true anchors in a sea of speculation. Each receipt represented a moment where the killer had stepped out of the woods and into the fluorescent light of a storefront, trading the belongings of dead men for enough cash to buy another night in a motel or a few rounds of drinks at a local bar. Among these papers, one particular receipt stood out. It was a slip from a pawn shop in Daytona, detailing the sale of a camera that had once belonged to Richard Mallory. On the signature line, a name was scrawled in a hurried, looping hand. C. Tyria Moore. The investigators leaned in, their eyes tracing the ink. It was an alias, a thin veil of a name that whispered of a partner, a companion in the dark. But it wasn't just the name that caught their attention. On the back of that small slip of paper was a smudge of ink, a thumbprint. It was a clear, Ridges and Valleys map of a person's identity, pressed firmly against the paper by someone who perhaps thought they were still invisible. This print was the thread that would begin to unravel the entire tapestry. The detectives began to cross-reference this thumbprint with every piece of evidence they had recovered from the victims' abandoned vehicles, looking for a match in the swirling patterns of oil and sweat left behind on steering wheels and door handles. Think back to that sweltering 4th of July in 1990. The heat would have been shimmering off the asphalt, the air thick with the smell of pine needles and exhaust. Near the Seminole Indian Reservation, a gray Pontiac Sunbird had careened off the road and smashed through a fence, coming to rest in the high grass. Witnesses had seen 2 women climbing out of the wreckage, disoriented and defensive. One of them was bleeding, her blonde hair matted with the dust of the crash. As the investigators processed the vehicle days later, they found more than just mechanical debris. They found a bloody palm print on the interior of the car, a stark, crimson mark of a struggle or a frantic exit. This car had belonged to Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary who had simply vanished. The palm print was a silent witness, waiting for the moment it could be compared to the ink on those pawn shop receipts. When the lab results finally came back, the connection was undeniable. The thumbprint from the pawned camera matched the forensic prints lifted from the cars. They weren't looking for a man anymore. They were looking for a woman with a record. The database hummed as it searched through thousands of files, eventually landing on a name that had surfaced in Florida's legal system before. Aileen Wuornos. The file revealed a woman who had been drifting through the state for years, a history of petty thefts, carrying concealed weapons and forged checks. Under the name Lori Grody and a dozen other aliases, she had lived a life on the extreme margins. But as the detectives looked at her previous mugshots, they saw the face that matched the descriptions given by the witnesses at the crash site. The puzzle pieces were no longer just scattered fragments. They were snapping together with a terrifying precision. They realized that the stolen items being pawned weren't just random thefts. They were trophies of a serial predator. Richard Mallory's tools, Walter Antonio's belongings, the small diamond ring that had been traded for $20. Each item was a link in a chain that led directly back to the woman who called herself Lee. The focus of the investigation shifted from the woods to the pawn shops and the biker bars. The detectives began to realize that the loyalty between the two women was the only thing keeping the secrets buried. But that loyalty was fraying. They knew about Tyria Wuornos, the silent partner whose name had been used on the receipts. They imagined the tension in their shared motel rooms, the flicker of the television screen illuminating the growing fear in Tyria's eyes as she realized the police were closing in. The forensic evidence was a cold, hard fact that could not be argued away. It wasn't just a theory. It was a palm print in blood and a thumbprint in ink. The net was being cast wide across the state, stretching from the quiet suburbs where the victims lived to the grimy roadside bars where Aileen sought refuge. The investigators moved with a new sense of urgency. Knowing that every day they didn't find her was another day, someone else might pull over to help a woman in distress on the side of the highway. As the sun set over the Florida landscape in early January of 1991, the detectives were no longer guessing. They had the names. They had the prints. They had the history of a woman who felt she had been discarded by the world and was now taking her revenge upon it. The breakthrough had come not from a single moment of luck, but from the tedious, painstaking work of matching ink to skin and paper to metal. The pieces of the puzzle were finally assembled, forming a portrait of a killer that the world had never seen before. The silence of the victims was finally being broken by the very things they had left behind: a camera, a car, a fingerprint. The hunt was reaching its peak, and the shadows were retreating. The story was moving toward its inevitable conclusion. A confrontation in a bar called The Last Resort, where the ghost would finally be forced into the light. The atmosphere inside the Last Resort bar in Port Orange was thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke, spilled draft beer, and the heavy humidity that often clings to the Florida coast even in the heart of winter. It was early January in 1991, and the air outside had turned surprisingly cold, dropping toward 40 degrees. Inside, the dim glow of neon signs cast long, flickering shadows across the worn wooden floors and the green felt of the pool tables. The muffled thud of cue balls colliding and the low rumble of motorcycle engines from the parking lot outside provided a constant, rhythmic backdrop to the evening. For Aileen, this was a place of familiar comfort, a dive where she could blend into the background among the bikers and the drifters. She did not know that across the street, in the shadows of the palms, the eyes of the law were finally fixed upon her, watching every movement through the amber light of the bar windows. The surveillance team had been meticulously assembled. Among them were two undercover officers, Mike Joyner and Dick Martin, who had adopted the personas of two drug dealers down from Georgia. To those they encountered, they were known only by their colorful aliases, Bucket and Drums. They moved through the bar with a practiced ease, wearing the rough clothing and hardened expressions of men who lived on the fringes of society. Their goal was simple but delicate. They needed to get close to the woman they now knew was linked to a string of missing men and abandoned vehicles along the highway. They had to be patient, allowing the narrative to unfold naturally so as not to spook their target. They bought rounds of beer and struck up casual conversations, their microphones hidden beneath layers of denim, transmitting every word back to a command post at the nearby Pirate Cove Motel, where authorities from 6 different jurisdictions waited in breathless silence. On the evening of January 8th, the interaction began to deepen. Joyner and Martin sat near Aileen, offering her a drink and engaging in the kind of aimless, barroom chatter that fills the hours between dusk and midnight. Aileen, looking weary and perhaps relieved to find what she thought were friendly faces, accepted the beer. She spoke of the cold and the difficulty of finding a place to rest. The undercover duo played their parts perfectly, never pushing too hard for information, instead letting the rhythm of the night dictate the flow. At one point, she suggested they all go out together, even advising them to bring all of their cash, a chilling suggestion in hindsight. As the clock ticked past midnight and into the early morning of January 9th, she declined a ride and instead chose to stay at the bar. She spent those final hours of her freedom curled up on an old car seat in the back, a makeshift bed in a place that had become her final sanctuary. When the sun rose on January 9th, the tension among the surveillance teams reached a breaking point. The operation had almost been compromised twice by well-meaning local patrol officers who were unaware of the larger trap being set. In one instance, a patrol car had pulled up behind Aileen as she walked along Ridgewood Avenue with its lights off, nearly triggering a premature confrontation. Each time, the command post had to scramble to pull the uniformed officers back, keeping the path clear for bucket and drums. By 10 o'clock that morning, the bar opened its doors again, and Aileen was back inside, drinking a beer and shooting pool. The undercover officers returned, their presence now a familiar part of her morning. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing in. The decision was made at the command post. They could wait no longer. They would lure her out into the open air where the arrest could be made without the risk of a shootout inside the crowded bar. The undercover agents suggested to Aileen that they head to their motel room so she could get cleaned up and rest in a proper bed. It was a simple offer of kindness that served as the final hook. As she stepped out of the last resort and onto the concrete steps, the transition from the dim, smoky interior to the bright Florida sun was jarring. Waiting just out of sight was Larry Horzepa of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office. As she walked toward the vehicle, he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. He did not mention the 7 bodies found in the woods or the fingerprints on the abandoned cars. Instead, he informed her that she was being taken into custody on an outstanding warrant for a woman named Lori Grody, an alias she had used in the past. The handcuffs clicked into place, the cold metal biting into her wrists for the first time in this long, bloody saga. Aileen appeared more confused than combative in those first few moments. She questioned why she was being arrested, demanding to know what the warrant was for, still seemingly unaware that the net had fully closed around her. The officers were careful not to tip their hand, keeping the conversation strictly to the minor warrant as they led her to a waiting patrol car. The entire sequence was captured on video by a hidden camera, a grainy record of the moment. The most notorious female serial killer in American history was finally removed from the highways. As the car pulled away from the last resort, leaving the biker bar and its ice-cold beer behind, the silence in the surveillance van was profound. They had her in custody, but the work was far from over. They had no murder weapon and no confession. They had the woman, but they still needed to find the truth hidden within her stories. The hunt had ended, but the psychological battle for justice was only just beginning. Inside the Volusia County Jail, the air was a thick, stagnant mixture of floor wax and old coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, unrelenting buzz that seemed to vibrate deep within the skull. For Aileen, the walls were closing in, a stark contrast to the open Florida highways she had called home for so many years. She sat in a small, windowless room, her hands restless on the cold metal surface of the table. Every sound was magnified. The heavy clink of a guard's keys in the hallway, the distant muffled shout of another inmate, the rhythmic scratching of a detective's pen against a yellow legal pad. She had been arrested on January 9th, 1991, at a biker bar called The Last Resort, but the real battle was not happening in this room yet. It was happening across a telephone line, where the only person she ever truly loved was being used as the ultimate leverage. While Aileen sat in her cell, Tyria Moore was miles away, cocooned in a sterile motel room in Ocala, surrounded not by comfort, but by investigators. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap floral air freshener. Tyria, who had once been Aileen's anchor, was now the primary tool for the state of Florida. She had been brought back from Pennsylvania under the heavy shadow of potential prosecution. The detectives knew that Aileen was a fortress, a woman hardened by decades of abuse and survival who would never break for her own sake. But they also knew she had a weakness. They knew she would set the world on fire if it meant keeping Tyria safe. In that motel room, Detective Mike Joyner sat beside Tyria, coaching her, feeding her lines, and waiting for the moment the phone would ring. It was a calculated psychological siege, designed to turn Aileen's greatest devotion into the key that would lock her away forever. The phone calls began on January 14th and stretched over 3 agonizing days. Each time the receiver was lifted, the tape recorder's reels began to spin with a soft, mechanical hiss. The sound of Tyria's voice on the other end was like a lifeline to Aileen, but it was a lifeline made of barbed wire. Tyria sounded small, frightened, and weary. She told Aileen that the police were everywhere, that her family was a nervous wreck, and that she was terrified of going to prison for crimes she claimed to have no part in. The investigators were relentless, writing notes for Tyria to read, telling her to cry, to sound as though she was at the end of her rope. They were painting a picture of a woman who was about to be destroyed by association, and they watched as the cracks began to spiderweb across Aileen's resolve. One particular call pushed the limits of Aileen's endurance. Tyria spoke of the pressure, the way the police were leaning on her, accusing her of being an accomplice, of helping to hide the stolen goods from the men who had disappeared. Aileen listened to the tremors in Tyria's voice, the sound of a woman she had tried to protect above all else. In her mind, she saw the life they had tried to build, the cheap motels, the dreams of a normal life that had always stayed just out of reach. The weight of the truth began to settle in the room, heavy and suffocating. Aileen knew that if she stayed silent, Tyria might really go to jail. The investigators held that threat like a blade to Tyria's throat, and Aileen, sitting in the cold shadows of the jail, could feel the edge of it. She could not bear the thought of Tyria in a cell like hers, losing the one thing she had left. On January 16th, 1991, the final wall crumbled. The air in the interrogation room seemed to thin as Aileen leaned toward the telephone. Her voice, usually defensive and sharp, softened into something raw and tragic. She told Tyria not to worry anymore. She promised her that she would not let her go to jail. It was a moment of profound, almost religious sacrifice in Aileen's mind. She decided to carry the entire weight of 7 deaths on her own shoulders to ensure Tyria walked free. She began to speak, her words tumbling out into the tape recorder, a confession that would seal her fate. She admitted to the killings, though she insisted they were acts of self-defense, a desperate reaction to the violence she had encountered on the road. But the nuances of her defense did not matter to the detectives in that moment. All that mattered was the confession. As the last words were spoken, a heavy silence descended upon the Volusia County Jail. The recording ended with a final, definitive click, the sound of a door locking for the final time. Aileen had given the state exactly what they needed. She had traded her life for Tyria's immunity, a bargain born of a desperate, fatal love. The weight of truth was not just about the facts of the murders, but about the crushing reality of betrayal. Tyria would soon become the star witness for the prosecution, turning the very love Aileen had tried to protect into the evidence that would lead to a death sentence. In the quiet of the night, the hum of the jail lights continued, indifferent to the woman who had just surrendered everything she had left. Aileen sat in the darkness, alone with the truth she had finally spoken, while the world outside began to prepare for the end. The courtroom in DeLand, Florida, felt like a hollowed-out tomb in the early morning light. It was January 14, 1992. The air inside was thick and stagnant, carrying the faint, sharp scent of lemon-scented floor wax and the musty aroma of old wood. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, the sound muffled by the thick carpeting. Aileen sat at the defense table, her presence filling the room with a restless energy. She was dressed in a suit that seemed too large for her frame, a borrow from a life she had never known. The judge, Uriel Blount, looked down from his high bench, his face etched with gravity. Above them, the ceiling fans turned with a slow, rhythmic click, barely moving the humidity that clung to the skin of every person in the gallery. Outside those heavy doors, a storm of flashes and shouting reporters created a jagged contrast to the silence within. The media had descended upon the small town like a fever. They had given Aileen a title that would follow her into history, the first female serial killer in America. It was a phrase that felt heavy and sharp, a label designed to sell newspapers. To the public, she was no longer a person. She was a spectacle, a monster with what they called reptilian eyes. The headlines were relentless, painting a picture of a predatory hitchhiker who hunted men for sport. They didn't speak of the decades of brokenness that preceded the violence. They only saw the death count, and they were hungry for a verdict that would confirm their fears about the darkness hidden within a woman. As the trial began, the prosecution, led by John Tanner, moved with a calculated, surgical precision. They relied on a legal strategy known as the Williams Rule, a move that would change everything for the defense. This allowed the state to bring in evidence from the other 6 killings, even though Aileen was only being tried for the murder of Richard Mallory. One by one, the photographs of the crime scenes were projected onto a screen, the dark blood looking like black ink. The jury, comprised of 7 men and 5 women, watched in a silence so deep you could hear the soft scratch of the court reporter's machine. The prosecution presented the high-standard .22 caliber revolver. They argued that these weren't acts of desperation, but a pattern of calculated robbery and murder. Tricia Jenkins, the public defender, stood before the jury with a soft voice that served as an anchor. The defense tried to pull the jury back to that night in November 1989, into the dark, wooded area where Richard Mallory had driven Aileen. They spoke of a struggle, an act of brutal violence where Mallory had raped and sodomized her. The defense argued that the gun was the only thing standing between Aileen and her own death. But the prosecution was quick to point out the inconsistencies in her confessions. They noted that she had appeared calm in the videotapes, and that she had stolen the victim's car and pawned his radar detector. Each piece of evidence felt like a brick being added to a wall closing in around her, slowly cutting off her air. The turning point came when the side door opened and Tyria Moore was called to the stand. The atmosphere in the room shifted, becoming charged with an agonizing tension. Tyria was the one person Aileen had truly loved, the person she had confessed to in an attempt to keep her safe from the police. Now Tyria sat just a few feet away, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the woman she had once called her own. In a quiet, steady voice, she testified. She told the jury that Aileen had never mentioned being raped on the night Mallory died. She spoke of the items they had sold and the life they had tried to build on the proceeds. It was a betrayal that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. Aileen watched her, her expression flickering between deep grief and a burning sense of betrayal. The jury did not take long to deliberate. After only 2 hours of weighing the evidence, they returned to their seats with a heavy finality. When the clerk read the word guilty, a sharp, collective intake of breath echoed through the gallery. In that moment, the thin veil of composure that Aileen had maintained snapped. Her voice, raw and filled with a decade of accumulated rage, tore through the courtroom. She screamed at the jury, calling them scumbags and swearing that she had been raped, her words a jagged cry of defiance against a system she felt had abandoned her long ago. As the bailiffs moved in to lead her away, the sound of the gavel falling was lost in the chaos. The trial for Richard Mallory was over, but the shadow of the executioner's chair was now looming large over the Highway Queen. The roar of the courtroom fades into the persistent, mechanical hum of the Broward Correctional Institution. After the whirlwind of the trials and the flashes of the photographer's bulbs, Aileen was ushered into the absolute stillness of the long corridor. This was her new world, a place where time did not move in hours, but in the slow accumulation of dust on a narrow windowsill. Every single day was just the same. The transition from the highway drifter to the condemned prisoner was a jarring descent into silence. She was no longer Aileen, the woman with the revolver. She was number 150924. The transition marked the beginning of a decade-long wait within walls of cold cinderblock. Here, the Florida heat didn't feel like the sun on asphalt. It felt like a heavy, airless weight that pressed against the skin of everyone inside her world. Her cell was a universe of 9 feet by 6 feet. Within those narrow margins, every object was fixed, bolted down by the finality of the law. There was a stainless steel toilet, a single metal shelf, and a small footlocker for the few possessions she was allowed to keep. Her bed was a thin mattress on a metal frame, a place where sleep offered little rest. A black-and-white television sat in the corner, a flickering window to a world she was no longer permitted to touch. The door was not made of bars, but of solid metal with a small hatch that would slide open for food trays or mail. Every hour, a set of eyes would appear at that hatch, a silent count that reminded her, 24 times a day, that she was property of the state. As the years stretched from 1992 toward the millennium, isolation began to carve deep channels into Aileen's psyche. The long corridor wasn't just the hallway outside her cell. It was the psychological distance between the person she had been and the person she was becoming. Her lawyers watched as she drifted away from the self-defense narrative that had once been her anchor. She began to speak of the world as a corrupt and rotting thing. The hatred she felt wasn't directed at a single man anymore. It was a vast fire. She wrote letters that grew increasingly erratic, filled with a jagged, desperate energy. She was a woman trapped not just by steel, but by the echoes of every trauma she had ever endured, now amplified by the absolute silence of solitary confinement. By the year 2001, the cracks in her reality were impossible to ignore. Aileen began to claim that the prison was using sonic weaponry against her, beaming frequencies into her cell to scramble her thoughts. She became convinced that the guards were poisoning her food, serving her potatoes cooked in dirt or tainting her trays. In her letters, she spoke of her head being shrunken by mysterious forces, and of prison matrons conspiring to drive her to suicide before the state could finish its work. These were the delusions of a mind that had been left alone with its own darkness for too long. Her attorneys fought to prove she was no longer competent, that her mind had fractured under the pressure, but Aileen fought back. She didn't want their help. She wanted the final silence. The legal struggle became a bizarre tug-of-war. Her lawyers, desperate to save a woman they believed was mentally ill, filed appeal after appeal. But Aileen, fueled by fury and exhaustion, worked to sabotage them. She told the Florida Supreme Court that she wanted to fire her legal team and waive her rights. She wrote that she was tired of the crazy stuff and that she knew what she had done. "I killed those men," she would say, her voice cold as ice, "and I would do it again." She described herself as a person who seriously hated human life. To her, the legal process was another way for the system to torture her, and she was determined to snatch the power back by demanding her own death. In the final months of 2002, the state prepared to conclude the journey. Governor Jeb Bush signed the death warrant, and a stay was briefly granted to evaluate her mental state. 3 psychiatrists visited her, peering into her mind to see if she understood the connection between her crimes and the needle. They concluded that despite her delusions about sonic rays and poisoned food, she understood what was coming. The stay was lifted. Aileen spent her final days at the Broward facility listening to music and writing letters. She declined a final meal, opting only for a cup of black coffee. The long corridor was reaching its end, leading her away from the orange t-shirts toward the white-walled chamber in Stark. The air in Bradford County, Florida, was heavy with the familiar, stifling humidity of early October as the sun began its slow ascent on the 9th day of the month in the year 2002. Inside the stark, imposing walls of the Florida State Prison, a different kind of stillness had taken hold of the hallways. This was the final morning for Aileen Wuornos, a woman whose life and crimes had been dissected by the public, the courts, and the global media for over a decade. The transition from the chaotic, violent world of the highways to the clinical, silent ritual of the state's ultimate punishment was almost complete. The morning was quiet, save for the distant hum of the prison's machinery and the soft, rhythmic footsteps of guards moving through the concrete corridors of the death watch area. In the hours before the dawn, Aileen had declined the traditional last meal. Where others might have requested a final feast of comfort foods or a childhood favorite, she chose something far simpler, a singular gesture of defiance or perhaps a reflection of a mind already drifting toward a different, distant horizon. She asked only for a single cup of black coffee. One can imagine the steam rising from the plastic cup in the dim, gray light of her cell, the bitter aroma filling the small space as she sat, perhaps for the last time, in a moment of solitary reflection. She had spent 10 years on death row, and by this morning she seemed to have made a strange, internal peace with the end. She had long ago abandoned her legal appeals, famously declaring that she was tired of the battles. To her, the execution was not a moment of fear, but a departure. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, the process began to move toward its inevitable conclusion. Aileen was escorted from her cell, a small, solitary figure surrounded by the high-security protocols of the state. The walk to the execution chamber is often described as a long, echoing journey, but for Aileen, it was a path she had mentally walked many times before. Inside the chamber, the environment was sterile and cold, illuminated by the harsh, unflinching glow of fluorescent lights that hummed with a low, electric frequency. She was secured to the gurney, her arms outstretched, as the medical team prepared the intravenous lines. There was no visible panic in her eyes. Instead, witnesses noted a calm, almost serene expression, as if she were a traveler at a station, waiting for a train that was finally pulling in. The world outside, the glass was silent, as the witnesses watched her face. Before the curtain was drawn back for the final time, the opportunity for speech was given. Aileen spoke words that would haunt the room long after they were uttered. She said, "I would just like to say I am sailing with the Rock, and I will be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, Big Mother Ship and all, I will be back." It was a cryptic, surreal farewell that hinted at the deep complexities and the fractures of her mental state. As the lethal chemicals began their silent work through the tubes, the room remained hushed. The procedure was swift and clinical. At precisely 9:47 in the morning, the physicians signaled that her heart had stopped. The storm that had been Aileen Wuornos finally went quiet, leaving only the official records and the heavy silence of the chamber behind as her body was prepared for the hearse. As the state closed its books on Aileen, the focus must rightfully return to the 7 lives she took, the men whose stories were prematurely ended along the dusty shoulders of Florida's roads. We remember Richard Mallory, the electronics store owner whose disappearance in late 1989 first signaled the beginning of this tragedy. We remember David Spears and Charles Karskadden, whose bodies were found in the heat of the following May and June. We pause for Peter Seams, a retired merchant seaman whose body was never recovered, leaving a void of uncertainty for those who loved him. We honor the memory of Troy Burress, a family man and salesman, and Charles Dick Humphreys, a retired Air Force major and former police chief who had spent his life serving the public. Finally, we remember Walter Gino Antonio, whose life was taken in November of 1990. These were not just names in a file. They were fathers, brothers, and friends whose absence left a permanent scar on the world. The case of Aileen Wuornos remains a haunting study of trauma, tragedy, and the long, difficult pursuit of justice. It is a story that began in the darkness of a troubled childhood and ended in the sterile light of a Florida prison. The highways she once traveled are now quiet, the old motels and roadside stops having faded into the background of a changing state. The legal debates and the media frenzy have long since settled, leaving behind a complex legacy that continues to challenge our understanding of crime and the human condition. As we step back from the details of these long-ago events, we find ourselves in the present moment, where the shadows of the past can finally be laid to rest. The noise of the world is distant now, and the weight of the story begins to lift, replaced by the stillness of the night and the steady rhythm of your breath. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.